The blazing Texas sun pressed down on Popular Drive that Saturday afternoon, the air thick and heavy, a humid blanket suffocating any hint of a breeze. From her front porch, her self-appointed throne, Clarice Whitman surveyed her domain. At 52, she considered herself the unofficial mayor of Plano, the vigilant gatekeeper who saw everything, remembered everyone. If you weren't part of her mental registry, if you hadn't been properly vetted, then suddenly, you were suspicious. And suspicion, in Clarice's meticulously ordered world, was a grave offense. Her perch on the porch was equipped for optimal observation. A little wicker table beside her held a glass of iced lemonade and, tellingly, a pair of binoculars. A floral sun hat shaded her pale forehead, a fragile defense against the relentless heat, but nothing could shield her from the urge to watch. She always watched. That's when she saw her. A black woman, mid-40s, lean build, a dark green swimsuit gleaming under the oppressive sun. Sunglasses obscured her eyes, and a paperback book rested on her stomach as she lay by the pool at the corner house. That house had just sold 3 weeks ago, a quiet transaction that had already rubbed Clarice the wrong way. No moving truck, no welcome party, no introductions, no attempt to greet the established neighbors. And now, this woman had the audacity to sunbathe like she owned the place. Too comfortable, too casually settled. Clarice sat up straighter in her wicker chair, a prickle of annoyance turning into a cold certainty. Something felt off. She grabbed her phone, squinting at the figure again through the shimmering heat. The non-emergency line in her contacts beckoned. She hesitated for a half-second, a fleeting whisper of doubt, then shook her head and pressed call. Collin County Police Dispatch, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Clarice's voice turned syrupy, the kind reserved for customer service calls and concerned citizen complaints. Hi, yes, I'm calling from Popular Drive. I think someone might be trespassing. There's a woman at the old Henderson place, backyard, near the pool. I don't think she lives there. Can you describe her? She's, black, mid-40s, I guess, wearing a swimsuit. Just laying there like it's her house. I don't recognize her at all. Clarice heard the dispatcher pause, a beat of silence on the line. Any signs of forced entry? No, but you never know, Clarice pushed, her voice gaining a righteous edge. She could have jumped the fence or maybe someone left the back gate unlocked. Clarice lowered her phone and stared again. The woman by the pool took a slow sip of her drink, then calmly flipped a page in her book, utterly unbothered, as calm as a breeze. She wasn't hiding, wasn't sneaking around. And that, paradoxically, made Clarice even more suspicious. She just looks out of place, Clarice added, as if that were a legitimate crime. The dispatcher asked for her name. Clarice gave it without hesitation. 2 officers were dispatched. ETA 8 minutes. Clarice set her phone down, folded her arms across her chest, and stared hard at the woman, willing something to happen, anything to validate the uneasy feeling in her gut. But nothing happened. The woman just laid there, enjoying her afternoon, like she belonged. But Clarice, in her heart, had already decided she didn't. She had pulled the trigger on a judgment, a quiet act of perceived civic duty, unaware that someone else was watching too, and that her assumptions were about to explode into a very public, very painful consequence. 8 minutes after Clarice's call, a black and white squad car cruised slowly down Popular Drive, followed closely by another. Clarice, ever the diligent citizen, straightened her blouse and stepped forward as if she had just happened to be outside, idly watering her flowers. The first officer, tall, tan-skinned, with a square jaw, stepped out and looked around. Are you the caller, Clarice smiled, trying to sound casual, perfectly composed. Yes, that's her. Right there in the backyard. The officer peered through the slats in the wooden fence, his partner moving to the side gate which, as Clarice had suspected, was unlocked. They slipped inside, careful but not exactly quiet. Clarice stayed behind her hedge, a flutter of triumph in her chest, her heart suddenly beating faster. Perhaps she'd finally proven her point, that her instincts, her vigilant watch, were indeed justified. But on the other side of that fence, someone was already standing up, and it wasn't Clarice who was about to be caught off guard. Danielle Monroe heard the gate creak before she saw them, two elongated shadows stretching across the concrete beside the pool, growing longer with each approaching step. She lifted her sunglasses slightly, just enough to make eye contact, her hand resting on the arm of her lounger, fingers curled around the cold glass of iced tea. She was calm, steady, betraying no hint of surprise or alarm. She didn't flinch. One of the officers called out, his voice tinged with professional caution. "We're responding to a report of trespassing. Can we speak with you for a moment?" Danielle slowly sat up, her paperback book slipping off her lap and onto the chair beside her. She took a breath, placed her drink on the patio table, and stood. Her movements were deliberate, measured, like someone who had rehearsed this exact scene before, perhaps countless times, in countless different contexts. "I live here," she said, her voice firm but polite, a quiet statement of fact. "This is my house." The taller officer, his badge reading R. Ortega, shifted his weight, a subtle discomfort in his posture. "We got a call from a neighbor who wasn't sure. Do you have ID, Danielle tilted her head, just slightly, a gesture that held a delicate balance of curiosity and challenge. "Sure, I do." She walked over to the small patio cabinet, opened it, and pulled out a leather tote. There was no rush, no hint of panic in her movements. As she unzipped the inside pocket, she looked directly at Officer Ortega. "Out of curiosity," she asked, her voice still level, "do you usually ask people sunbathing by their pool to show ID, or only when someone looks like me?" The other officer, Officer Perry, young, maybe 30, pale, and clearly uncomfortable, glanced at his partner. "It's just standard protocol, nothing personal," he offered, a placating tone in his voice. Danielle gave a tight, almost imperceptible smile. "It's always nothing personal," she murmured, "until it is." She pulled out a wallet, opened it, and flipped it directly to her badge. It gleamed in the sun, catching the harsh light. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Deputy Director. Ortega blinked, took half a step back, a visible jolt running through him. Danielle didn't move. She watched them, not angry, not smug, just tired. "I bought this house 3 weeks ago," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "moved in last Friday. I've been too busy to meet the neighbors because I've been in Washington preparing testimony for a Senate Intelligence Committee. But today, I decided to take the afternoon off. Thought I'd enjoy my own backyard. You'll understand if I didn't expect company." Perry cleared his throat, thoroughly chastened. "We didn't know, Sorry. Someone called it in." Danielle turned and walked back to her lounger. She sat down, reaching for her book again. "Let me guess," she said, her voice laced with a dry certainty. "White woman, short brown hair, binoculars on the porch." Officer Ortega didn't answer, but his eyes gave it away. Danielle nodded to herself. "Figures." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken embarrassment. Neither officer knew what to say, how to extricate themselves from this swiftly escalating blunder. The silence stretched until Danielle spoke again, her voice still calm, but now with a sharp, precise edge. "Tell her she can stop watching me now. And maybe go clean her own backyard before worrying about mine." Officer Ortega muttered another apology, nodded, and the two turned to leave, their retreat hastened. The gate clicked shut behind them. Back on her porch, Clarice stood with arms crossed, trying to read the officers' faces. They didn't stop to talk, didn't say a word, just walked quickly back to their cruisers and drove off. Clarice's stomach dropped, a cold, sickening lurch. That woman wasn't a trespasser. She was the owner. And not just that, someone important. But this wasn't just a moment of embarrassment for Clarice. It was the start of a storm she couldn't control, and the neighborhood was about to feel it too. Clarice stood frozen on her porch, still clutching her glass of lemonade like it could anchor her to the moment. Her face felt hot, a flush that had nothing to do with the sun and everything to do with a sudden, suffocating wave of shame, or perhaps fear, she wasn't sure which. The officers hadn't even glanced her way as they pulled off, no explanation, no handshake, just a tight turn of the wheel and a quick roll down Popular Drive, as if eager to escape the raw awkwardness that had just transpired. Clarice looked back toward the yard. Danielle Monroe was still there, sitting comfortably now, book in hand again. It was as if nothing had happened, As if Clarice hadn't just tried to throw her afternoon into chaos with one misguided phone call. Clarice stepped inside her house and shut the door with a quiet click. The air conditioning felt too cold against her skin, a jarring contrast to the heat still burning in her cheeks. She walked to the kitchen and set the glass down on the counter, then stood there for a long moment, unmoving. Deputy Director of the FBI. That sentence rolled around in her head like a stone in a dryer, tumbling over and over, each rotation intensifying the humiliation. She walked to the living room, picked up her tablet, and did a quick search, Danielle R. Monroe FBI. The articles loaded instantly, images of Danielle standing next to senators, giving press statements, attending high-security briefings. Appointed just 3 months ago, a career federal agent, Ivy League educated, commended for undercover work, lived briefly in D.C., Baltimore, Phoenix. Clarice stared at the screen, her face slowly draining of color. She wasn't just wrong, she was loud and wrong, and the whole thing, it was entirely avoidable. Her phone buzzed, a message from Carol Ferguson. Heard the cops were on your street. Everything okay? Clarice didn't answer. She opened Facebook and started scrolling. It was only a matter of time before someone posted about it. Someone always did. And sure enough, there it was, a blurry photo snapped through a fence, 2 cops in a backyard, a woman in a swimsuit holding what looked suspiciously like a badge. The caption read, "When the new neighbor turns out to be a boss." The comments were worse. "You'll really called the cops on the FBI. This is why folks mind their business. Popular drive about to end up on the news." Clarice put the tablet down. Everything felt off now. Her heartbeat was slower but heavier, like her chest had been stuffed with cotton. Her house, once her sanctuary, suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. The doorbell rang. Clarice flinched, her feet staying planted for a few seconds longer than necessary before she forced herself to walk to the door. She looked through the peephole. Danielle Monroe stood on the other side, no sunglasses now, just her face, calm, composed, unreadable. Clarice opened the door halfway, a narrow slit of apprehension. Danielle didn't wait. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice even. "I figured we should talk face to face." Clarice opened her mouth, but no words came out. Danielle continued, her gaze steady, unwavering. "You called the cops on me. I know you did. I get it. You saw someone you didn't recognize, made an assumption, and thought you were doing something responsible." Clarice swallowed hard. I didn't know that I lived here," Danielle said, one eyebrow raised, a subtle inflection in her voice. "Or that someone like me could live here." Clarice's face flushed again, a deeper, hotter wave of embarrassment. She tried to find the right words, to formulate an excuse, a defense, but they wouldn't come. Danielle held her gaze, her composure unbroken. "I didn't come over here to yell at you," she said, her voice softening slightly. "I've had enough of that in my life. I just wanted you to see me, really see me. Because next time, it might not be someone with a badge and a title. It might be a teenager, or a delivery guy, or someone just trying to breathe for 5 minutes without being treated like they're breaking into their own life." Clarice looked down, finally, unable to meet that steady gaze. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. Danielle didn't say, "It's okay." She didn't offer forgiveness. She just nodded once. "I'll be back at work next week. Until then, I'd like to enjoy my home without binoculars on me." She turned and walked away. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because when someone shakes the unspoken rules of a place like Popular Drive, people either learn from it or double down, and Clarice was about to find out which way the wind was blowing. Sunday morning hit differently. Clarice woke up with a headache, the kind that comes from thinking too much and sleeping too little. She dragged herself into the kitchen, brewed coffee, and meticulously avoided the living room window like it was toxic. She didn't want to look across the street. She didn't want to see Danielle's backyard. She didn't want to see her own reflection in the glass, a mirror of her recent folly. By 9 a.m., her phone had already buzzed 4 times. A group chat with Carol and 2 other neighbors was pinging non-stop. "Carol, so it's true, she's FBI? Janice, I saw her at the corner market once, real quiet, kept her head down. Eleanor, why'd you call the cops though, Clarice?" Clarice didn't respond. What was she supposed to say? That she panicked? That she thought she was doing her duty? That she mistook peace and quiet for something criminal? Outside, a few neighbors walked by. Usually, they'd wave, smile, maybe call out a greeting. Today, they barely looked at her house. Later that afternoon, she walked to her mailbox. The sun was blazing, but her skin felt colder than ever as she reached for the envelope bundle. She heard a voice from across the street. Afternoon. It was Mr. Singh, 3 doors down, who owned the blue pickup with the faded bumper sticker. A retired math teacher, usually friendly. Clarice turned, ready to return the greeting, but something in his tone stopped her. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. "Lot of people talking," he said flatly, his eyes holding a quiet disappointment. "I told my daughter to Google your name. Said if someone was going to call the cops over sunbathing, she ought to know what kind of place she's visiting." Clarice opened her mouth, but Mr. Singh had already turned away, leaving her standing there, the silence heavy with his unspoken judgment. Inside, she sat at her dining room table and stared out the front window. Her block, the one she'd always tried to keep in order, was now moving without her, like she wasn't part of it anymore. The doorbell rang again. Clarice froze. But it wasn't Danielle this time. It was Officer Ortega. She opened the door slowly, her stomach tightening with renewed dread. "Afternoon, Ms. Whitman," he said, his tone professional, but with an underlying gravity. "Just wanted to follow up about yesterday's call and clarify something." Clarice blinked. "Okay. You should know," he began, his gaze steady. "Every time someone files a report like that, especially when there's no threat, no crime, and it turns out to be nothing, it's recorded and flagged." She stiffened. "Flagged?" He nodded. "Yes, because if it becomes a pattern, the person making those calls might be investigated for harassment or discrimination, depending on context." Clarice didn't speak. He continued. "We take our time seriously. And the communities, too." She nodded once, embarrassed, humiliated. Ortega gave her a look that wasn't cruel, not harsh, just steady and pointed. "I'm not here to scold. But I think it's time you think real hard about what made you call and who you thought you were protecting this neighborhood from." Then he tipped his head and walked off. Clarice shut the door quietly behind him. She sat back down, heart pounding, face hot. The line between watching out and watching over had blurred completely. She'd convinced herself she was the guardian of Popular Drive, but now, people were guarding themselves from her. But sometimes, the most painful part isn't public shame. It's facing the truth in private. And Clarice was about to sit with hers, whether she liked it or not. Clarice didn't leave the house for the rest of the day. She didn't pull weeds like she usually didn't fold her chair out onto the porch. The binoculars sat on the wicker table, gathering dust, silent witnesses to her self-inflicted isolation. By Monday morning, the whole street seemed quieter. Not in the comforting, peaceful way she was used to, but in that people watching you now kind of quiet. It was the kind of silence where doors closed a little faster when she walked by, where conversations paused abruptly when she approached. That evening, just before dusk, Danielle Monroe stood at her mailbox, retrieving her mail. Same calm posture, same silent confidence. But this time, she wasn't alone. A few neighbors had gathered. Mr. Singh waved, the Lopez kids rode scooters, their giggles piercing the tense quiet, and even Carol Ferguson pretended to fix her roses while peeking over the fence. Danielle waved politely, exchanged small talk with Mr. Singh, and laughed at something his daughter said. Clarice watched from behind her curtain, her stomach tight with a familiar knot of discomfort. Danielle saw her. Their eyes locked, only for a moment, but it was enough. No judgment, just a clear, unwavering gaze. Later that week, an email went out to the entire block. Danielle had offered to host a neighborhood meet and greet that Saturday afternoon. Snacks, music, conversation. The message read, a simple invitation to connection. Let's get to know each other beyond the window pane. Clarice didn't RSVP. But when Saturday came, she stood by her front door, dressed and ready, a plate of homemade lemon bars wrapped in foil sitting on her counter, just in case. After nearly 20 minutes of pacing and churning guilt, she finally stepped outside. Her hands trembled, and every step across the street felt like walking into a courtroom. Danielle saw her coming this time. And she smiled. A real one. It wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't cold either. It was something in the middle. Genuine. Clarice offered the plate of lemon bars. They're homemade. Danielle took them without breaking eye contact. Thank you. There was a pause, a moment suspended in the humid air. Then Clarice, her voice barely above a whisper, finally spoke the words that had been choking her for days. I had a lot of excuses. None of them were good. Danielle nodded slowly, acknowledging the admission. It is a start. Clarice looked down at her shoes, then back up at Danielle. You didn't have to invite me. I didn't, Danielle said, her voice soft but firm. But I figured you needed it more than anyone. That line hit hard, but it didn't sting. It landed exactly where it should, a truth Clarice couldn't, and didn't, deny. Clarice stood beside her for the next hour, listening to conversations she'd never thought she'd be part of. She learned Danielle had nieces in Dallas, that she loved spicy food, that she once worked undercover at a pharmaceutical company for 9 months straight. And for the first time in a long time, Clarice felt like she was learning instead of judging. For the first time in a long time, Clarice felt like she was learning instead of judging. The lemon bars, once a prop for her nervous arrival, were now almost entirely gone, testament to an evening that had defied all her anxious expectations. She watched Danielle move through the small crowd, graceful and at ease, answering questions about her work, her life, her journey to Plano. It was easy to build fences in your head, Clarice realized. Easy to think you were the center of a place just because you'd been there the longest. But the world didn't spin around your comfort, and neighborhoods weren't safer when you called the cops on what you didn't understand. They were safer when you listened, when you checked yourself before checking others. Danielle hadn't had to extend that olive branch. She could have simply ignored Clarice, left her stewing in her humiliation. But she did. And Clarice, despite her ingrained resistance, didn't have to take it. But she did. Because growth isn't about getting it perfect the first time. It's about choosing to do better the next time. The party wound down as dusk settled, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. People exchanged farewells, promising to stay in touch. Clarice found herself lingering, a strange reluctance to return to the quiet, self-imposed isolation of her home. As Danielle walked her to the edge of the porch, a soft, comfortable silence settled between them. Thank you, Danielle, Clarice said, her voice still a little hesitant, but genuine. For everything. Danielle simply nodded, a knowing smile playing on her lips. This is a good start, Clarice. For all of us. Clarice watched her new neighbor walk back inside, a figure of quiet strength disappearing into the light. She realized then that this encounter, which had begun with such hostility and judgment, had somehow become a pivotal moment. It wasn't about a black woman moving into a white neighborhood, or an FBI chief being mistaken for a trespasser. It was about the fences people build, not just around their yards, but in their minds. And that night, on Popular Drive, one of those fences had finally, subtly, begun to crumble. The days that followed were different. Clarice still sat on her porch, but the binoculars remained tucked away. She waved at neighbors, offered genuine greetings, and found herself listening more than she spoke. She started conversations at the mailbox, shared gardening tips with Mr. Singh, and even exchanged recipes with Carol, who now spoke of Danielle with admiration. The quiet on Popular Drive changed from a tense, watchful silence to a comfortable hum of shared existence. One afternoon, Clarice saw Danielle working in her garden, kneeling amongst a bed of vibrant flowers. Clarice walked across the street, a small offering of freshly baked cookies in hand. Danielle looked up, smiled, and beckoned her over. They talked for a long while, about plants, about life, about the challenges of balancing a demanding career with personal peace. It was a simple conversation, yet profound. Clarice felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years, a genuine connection that transcended assumptions and prejudice. This was the lasting change. Not just a public apology or a cleared record, but a quiet, internal shift. Clarice had been forced to confront her own biases, to dismantle the rigid categories she had built for the world. Danielle, by simply being herself and extending an unexpected grace, had shown her a different way to be a neighbor, a different way to be human. It was a lesson learned the hard way, through discomfort and public exposure, but it was a lesson that truly stuck. So, if you've ever made a snap judgment about someone who didn't look like they belonged, ask yourself, belong to what, exactly? And who gave you the right to decide?